13. Brutal truths about traveling the Old West in a covered wagon. Before trains or highways, pioneers crossed thousands of miles in slow, creaking covered wagons. But the real journey wasn't the romantic adventure Hollywood promised. It was months of bone-rattling roads, constant danger, and relentless hardship. Let's pull back the canvas and uncover the brutal truths of traveling the Old West in a covered wagon. 6 months of sheer endurance. The very first harsh truth, and really the root of so many other challenges, was just how painfully long the trip actually took. Traveling by covered wagon was anything but quick. Even on the rare perfect day, with flat ground, good roads, and clear skies, a wagon might push about 20 miles. That was the dream scenario. In reality, most days they only managed somewhere between 8 and 20 miles, and sometimes even less. Rough trails, steep mountain passes, raging rivers, or brutal weather could slow the entire train to a crawl. Imagine starting from St. Louis, one of the most common launch points for the westward journey. The straight line distance to San Francisco is roughly 1,750 miles. At a steady 20 miles per day, you might think it would take around 90 days. But that's just theory, and theory didn't survive long on the trail. In real life, progress was constantly interrupted. Wagon wheels broke, livestock fell ill or collapsed from exhaustion. Sudden storms forced them to stop, and the terrain was rarely kind. There were no straight highways. The trails wound around obstacles, through deep valleys and over mountains, adding hundreds, sometimes even thousands of extra miles. The end result? Reaching the West Coast from St. Louis usually meant 6 long months of grinding travel. 6 months of battling the elements, rationing food, and living with almost no comfort at all. It was a brutal test of willpower and stamina. People became sick, suffered injuries, and tragically, some never made it. Those who did arrive had paid in sweat, time, and hardship, trading half a year of their lives for the slim promise of a fresh start. 6 months of mere survival, not living. It's almost impossible to truly imagine, isn't it? And the wagon they spent all those months in? It wasn't the cozy, rolling home Hollywood shows you. Your home was a wooden torture box. Now let's talk about the actual vehicle that carried them, the famous covered wagon. In movies, it's often shown in a romantic light, rolling majestically across the open plains. But in reality, the story was very different. The most famous version was the prairie schooner. It had curved wooden bows that created a rounded frame, covered in canvas, giving it the look of a ship's sail gliding over a sea of grass. Think of it as the 19th century minivan built to haul an entire family along with all their belongings. There was also the Conestoga wagon, which was bigger, heavier, and usually pulled by a larger team of animals. While impressive, its bulk made it poorly suited for long journeys across the continent. The Conestoga was far better for shorter hauls, like carrying freight between cities or delivering goods to nearby settlements. No matter which wagon you rode in, the trip was grueling. Forget paved roads, there were none. Trails were rough, often nothing more than deeply worn tracks carved into the earth. Bad weather could turn them into sticky, muddy pits that trapped wheels and slowed progress to a crawl. And here's the part most people don't realize. These wagons had absolutely no suspension. The wheels and axles were solid wood, with zero shock absorption. Every rock, every rut, every hard bump in the trail sent bone-rattling jolts straight through the wagon bed. Passengers were constantly tossed around hour after hour, day after day. Imagine sitting in a wooden box while someone shakes it violently without ever stopping. Oddly enough, the prairie schooner was considered smoother than the Conestoga, but that's not saying much. The Conestoga's size made it prone to tipping, and on narrow trails its wheels often slid off the path, making for an even rougher, more dangerous ride. To escape the non-stop pounding, many pioneers simply chose to walk alongside their wagons. But that meant covering hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles on foot, over the same unforgiving ground, exposed to blazing sun, driving rain, and biting wind. So the choice was grim: suffer through a jarring, back-breaking ride, or wear yourself out with an endless walk. Neither was comfortable, and that alone says everything about just how punishing the journey west really was. And if you thought you could escape the misery at night by sleeping inside, think again. Sleeping under the star and the rain. When you picture a covered wagon, it's easy to imagine a pioneer family huddled together inside at night, warm and sheltered after a long, dusty day. It sounds like the perfect little refuge on the trail, but the truth was far less cozy. Those prairie schooners weren't open living spaces, they were crammed full of the family's belongings. Every square inch was used for supplies, tools, food, and clothing. And the space wasn't large to begin with, only about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. Think of a queen-size bed. Then imagine trying to pack your entire life into it. There just wasn't room left for people to actually sleep inside. Because of that, most families bedded down outside. Sometimes they spread blankets right on the ground. Other times, they'd rig up a simple tent from extra canvas and a few poles. Either way, it offered very little protection from the elements. They were at the mercy of whatever nature threw their way: scorching sun during the day, biting cold at night, sudden rainstorms, and relentless wind. If the weather got really bad, they might crawl under the wagon for shelter, which meant lying on hard-packed dirt just to escape the worst of it. It made for long, uncomfortable nights and plenty of tossing and turning. After months of sleeping on the ground, sore backs were almost guaranteed. Dampness from rain or morning dew or the constant chill in the air often lingered until morning. Good sleep was rare, and comfort was something most pioneers simply had to learn to live without. And in the morning, the next challenge wasn't just moving forward, it was finding enough food to survive. The chuck wagon, heart of the camp. Picture yourself on the trail, heading west in your covered wagon. You've loaded up tools, clothing, and everything you think you'll need to start fresh. But here's the question: what about food? There weren't exactly grocery stores waiting along the Oregon Trail. Like we talked about earlier, those prairie schooners were packed tight with household goods, not shelves of ready-to-eat meals. So how did pioneers keep themselves and their families fed during a journey that could stretch to 6 months? That's where the chuck wagon came, in the wagon train's mobile kitchen. About the same size as a prairie schooner, it was specially fitted for storing ingredients and preparing meals. Without it, keeping everyone nourished on the long trek would have been nearly impossible. A chuck wagon often had a water barrel strapped to the side, giving quick access to drinking water during the day. Many carried coffee grinders too, because after hours of bone-rattling travel, a strong cup of coffee was more than just a treat. It was a necessity. Beneath the wagon sat the possum belly, a storage space for firewood and surprisingly dried cow dung, better known as cow chips. As unpleasant as that sounds, they were essential on the treeless plains. Cow chips burned slowly, producing enough steady heat to cook beans, fry bacon, or bake simple bread. It was a perfect example of pioneer ingenuity making do with whatever the land provided. When the wagons finally circled for the night, the chuck wagon became the heart of the camp. Cooks prepared humble meals like beans, bacon, and biscuits, while families gathered to share stories and laughter. It was more than just dinner, it was a rare chance to rest, connect, and feel a sense of normalcy. After a grueling day, sitting down to a hot meal, no matter how plain, must have felt like pure gold. But first, that meal had to be hauled across miles of brutal terrain, and for that, pioneers relied on some unlikely animals. Mules and oxen, the true workhorses. When we think of the Wild West, images of galloping horses and skilled riders often come to mind. And it's true many Native American tribes were expert horsemen, using their mounts for hunting, travel, and in battle. The U.S. Army and frontier scouts also leaned heavily on horses for speed and mobility. But one group was mostly left out of this so-called horse culture: the settlers. For the average pioneer family, owning a horse was simply out of reach. Horses were expensive to buy and even more costly to feed and maintain. Settlers were already spending nearly everything they had on a covered wagon, supplies, tools, and provisions for the long road ahead. A horse was a luxury they just couldn't justify. Instead, they put their trust in mules and oxen. These animals were far better suited to the journey west. Unlike horses, they could live off rough grasses and scrub along the trail, which meant fewer supplies to carry and lower costs. They were also stronger and far more resilient, capable of hauling fully loaded wagons over hundreds, even thousands of miles of rough and unforgiving terrain. Mules, known for their steady footing and cautious nature, excelled in steep and rocky mountain passes. oxen, though slower, were unbelievably strong and dependable, perfect for pulling massive loads over endless plains and through muddy river crossings. They became the backbone of the wagon trains. And when the journey was over, these animals kept working. Settlers relied on their mules and oxen to plow fields, haul timber, and handle the heavy labor of building a new home on the frontier. Horses might have looked more glamorous, but for the average family, practicality came first. In many ways, these quiet, tireless beasts of burden were the true heroes of westward expansion, pulling not just wagons, but the weight of a new civilization on their shoulders. If you had to cross the country in a covered wagon, what's the one thing you'd bring that pioneers never had? Canvas covers, flimsy against the elements. You might assume that at the very least the canvas cover kept people and their belongings safe from the worst of the weather. But out on the trail, the reality was far more complicated. Weather was a constant battle for pioneers making their way west. The canvas tops on those prairie schooners did provide a bit of shelter, but not nearly as much as you might think. The main problem? The canvas wasn't naturally waterproof. Settlers had to make it resistant to the elements before it was of much use. They typically started with thick cotton canvas, often weighing around 10 ounces. To prepare it, they coated the fabric with linseed oil, creating a water-repelling barrier that could help shield their goods from light rain or snow. Once treated, the canvas was carefully stretched over the wagon's wooden frame and secured tightly in place. But even this preparation had limits. Out on the open plains, wind was a constant, often punishing force. Rain rarely fell straight down. Strong gusts could drive it sideways, straight under the cover and onto everything inside. And when the skies were dry, the wind brought another misery: endless dust and sand. It whipped across the prairie, sneaking into every crack and seam of the wagon. It stung eyes, clogged noses, coated mouths, and clung to clothing and gear until everything felt gritty and uncomfortable. To fight back, some settlers sewed a drawstring along the canvas edges. This allowed them to pull the cover tight, creating a hood-like enclosure that offered a bit more defense against wind, slanting rain, and blowing grit. It wasn't perfect, but it made life a little more bearable. Still, no matter how well they prepared, one sudden, violent storm could undo it all, reminding them just how unforgiving the western trails could be. Breakdowns in the middle of nowhere. Imagine this: you're traveling hundreds of miles across open country in a covered wagon with no town in sight for days. Suddenly something breaks. There are no paved roads, no service stations, no tow trucks coming to help. It's just you, your damaged wagon, and the endless wilderness stretching in every direction. That was everyday reality for pioneers. Breakdowns were a constant worry. The unforgiving trails were merciless on wooden wagons. Wheels cracked or splintered when they hit rocks or deep ruts. Axles snapped under the strain of heavy loads. Even the few metal parts could bend, warp, or break clean off after miles of rough travel. When that happened, there was no calling for help. You had to fix it yourself. That's why pioneers always carried essential tools: hammers, saws, axes, nails, anything that might keep their wagon rolling. They also brought along spare parts, knowing that sooner or later something would give way. Still, even the best prepared traveler sometimes had to get creative. They patched things together with whatever they could find: a strong tree branch to replace a broken beam, strips of animal hide for binding, or any scrap material that could hold until a better repair was possible. A serious break meant the whole wagon train had to stop. Families unloaded every last item, a back-breaking chore in blazing heat, freezing wind, or pouring rain. Sometimes they had to tip the wagon on its side to reach the underside. And they did all this while staying alert for wildlife, unpredictable weather, and other dangers. Every repair finished was more than just a fix. It was a small but hard-earned victory, proof of their resilience and quick thinking. These pioneers were their own mechanics, problem solvers, and survivalists all in one. And the pressure was enormous because if you couldn't get your wagon moving, the train might leave you behind. Which part of this video made you smile? Or maybe even tear up a little? Share your thoughts, we read every comment. Rivers, the ultimate gamble. At some point, every pioneer family heading west had to face one of the most nerve-wracking challenges on the trail crossing rivers. While much of the western landscape was dry and open, Rivers and streams still cut across the route, forcing travelers to deal with fast-moving water that threatened people, livestock, and wagons alike. On larger rivers, there were sometimes ferry services, but these were expensive, and most settlers simply couldn't spare the money. That meant they had to ford the river driving their wagons, animals, and families straight through the water. It was a risky move that could go wrong in an instant. Smaller rivers didn't make things much easier. When no shallow crossing was available, pioneers often had to improvise, building rafts from whatever they could find. If there were trees nearby, they might lash logs together to create a makeshift ferry. If not, they had to get creative with scraps of wood, barrels, or anything that could float. Choosing the right crossing spot was absolutely crucial. They needed a narrow stretch with a calm, slow-moving current, and finding one could take hours or even days. Meanwhile, the weather could change quickly, turning a manageable stream into a dangerous torrent. Once a safe place was found, families would work to waterproof the wagon bed, coating it with wax and sealing every gap. The covered wagon now became a kind of boat, a very fragile boat. Then, with oxen straining in the harness, they would push forward into the current, hoping the water stayed shallow enough to keep the wagon upright. A successful crossing brought enormous relief, but it was never without risk. If the current proved too strong or the wagon too heavy, it could tip over in seconds, spilling precious supplies and sweeping livestock away. Worst of all, people could be injured or even drowned. River crossings were tense, heart-pounding events, a vivid reminder of how unforgiving the journey west could be. The fear of watching your wagon edge into the water, uncertain whether you'd make it to the other side, must have been overwhelming for everyone, young children, exhausted parents, and weary elders alike. And yet, rivers weren't the deadliest thing on the trail. The worst enemy was something you couldn't see at all: the invisible killers. So, just how dangerous was the Oregon Trail? The truth is, it's hard to pin down exact numbers. Just like estimates for how many people traveled it, the number of deaths varies depending on the source. Some historians put the mortality rate at roughly 4 to 6% of all travelers, which would mean between 12,000 and 24,000 lives lost. Others believe it could have been closer to 10%. And what claimed the most lives? Surprisingly, it wasn't constant attacks or gunfights like in the movies, it was accidents and disease. Pioneer diaries tell of tragic gun mishaps, deadly encounters with wild animals, drownings during river crossings, and deaths from exposure to extreme cold. Wagon accidents were also heartbreakingly common, with children sometimes falling under the heavy wheels. Life on the trail was fragile, and death was never far away. But the deadliest threat of all, the one they couldn't see coming, was disease. Sanitation was a nightmare. Bathing and washing clothes were rare luxuries, and clean drinking water could be hard to find. Streams and rivers were often contaminated with human waste, animal droppings, garbage, and the decaying bodies of livestock. Cholera, spread through tainted water, was the single biggest killer. Diphtheria, another highly contagious illness, took a devastating toll on children. The grueling journey, paired with poor nutrition, left travelers vulnerable to other deadly conditions: typhoid, mountain fever, likely tick-borne, dysentery, malaria, food poisoning, scurvy from a lack of vitamin C, and alkali poisoning from bad water. Measles, mumps, and smallpox swept through wagon trains, hitting the youngest and weakest the hardest. And for women, childbirth on the trail carried extreme risks, often without any trained medical help. In a world with almost no access to proper health care, even a minor sickness could spiral into something fatal. Disease hung over every camp like a shadow, an invisible enemy that struck without warning. The thought of watching a loved one grow weaker day by day, knowing there was nothing you could do, must have been one of the most helpless and heartbreaking experiences of the entire journey west. Which part of the journey would you fear most: river crossings, disease, or endless days on foot? Native American encounters, myths versus reality. Let's clear up one of the biggest misconceptions fueled by countless Western movies: the idea of wagon trains constantly circling up to fend off Native American attacks. The image is dramatic, but the reality was very different. During the main years of the Oregon Trail, outright conflict with Native Americans was actually uncommon. Historian John Unruh's research shows that between 1840 and 1860, fewer than 400 emigrants lost their lives in such attacks. When you compare that to the tens of thousands who died from disease or accidents, it becomes clear Native American raids, while frightening when they did happen, were not the biggest danger on the trail. In fact, more encounters between pioneers and Native Americans were peaceful, even cooperative. Native groups often traded food and supplies, offered ferry services across rivers, and sometimes helped care for livestock. These moments of assistance are far less celebrated in popular culture, but they were a genuine part of trail life. Wagon trains did often form a circle at night, but not for battle. The main reason was to corral their animals, keeping them from wandering off or being stolen. In the rare cases where attacks occurred, the wagons were usually moving in a column, not locked in a defensive ring like you see in films. Unfortunately, some of the conflicts that did erupt were sparked by the pioneers themselves. Cultural misunderstandings, arrogance, and violent acts such as shooting at Native Americans without provocation sometimes led to retaliation. And tragically, that retaliation didn't always target the offenders directly. Often, the next wagon train to come along suffered the consequences. After the 1850s, attacks became more frequent on smaller wagon groups or lone travelers. This reflected growing anger among Native Americans as more and more settlers pushed into their lands, disrupting their way of life. The relationship between pioneers and Native Americans was complicated, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, and the relentless push west only deepened those tensions. Recognizing that complexity gives us a far more accurate and fair view of this chapter in history. But even if you avoided conflict, simply reaching the end of the trail was no guarantee of relief. Arrival was not always the end of hardship. After 6 relentless months battling rough terrain, punishing weather, illness, and dangerous accidents, the pioneers finally caught sight of their destination. The wave of relief and joy they must have felt is hard to put into words. But here's the last harsh truth. Arriving didn't always mean the struggle was over. In fact, for some, it was just another chapter of hardship. Many reached the end of the trail in desperate condition. Some had burned through all their supplies and were literally starving. Others were weakened by sickness, barely able to keep going. Many had lost their wagons, their possessions, and every last dollar on tolls or unexpected expenses along the way. Imagine that after surviving disease, dangerous river crossings, wagon repairs in the middle of nowhere, and months of exhausting travel, they finally arrived in the promised land, with nothing left but the clothes on their backs. For some, the dream of a new beginning still felt heartbreakingly out of reach. Thankfully, earlier Oregon settlers often stepped in to help. They would organize relief parties, load up supply wagons, and head out to meet the newcomers at the Dalles, one of the key points near the end of the Oregon Trail. They brought food, clothing, and other essentials to help these exhausted travelers make it through the final leg of their journey. For many, that kindness was the thin line between life and death. It was a powerful reminder that even in a world as harsh as the western frontier, compassion and generosity could still thrive. The moment of receiving that help when you were worn down to nothing must have been deeply emotional, a lifeline at the very edge of collapse. And yet, the Oregon Trail's story didn't end there. Its impact lasted far beyond the last wagon wheel. Why they pushed on, motivation, and consequences. After hearing all these brutal truths, one question still hangs in the air. Why did they do it? What could possibly drive hundreds of thousands of people to risk so much, to endure dangers and hardships most of us can barely imagine? The answer lies in the dream they carried with them. The hope of a better life, the promise of owning their own land, and the belief that beyond the horizon was a future worth fighting for. That's what kept them moving forward. It's hard not to admire the sheer willpower of those pioneers, pushing west despite everything stacked against them. Whole families made the journey together, grandparents, parents, and young children, staking everything they had on the chance of a fresh start. In doing so, they became the human engine behind westward expansion, helping to open a new chapter in the story of the United States. But this history isn't only about grit and perseverance. it also carries a far more painful truth. As settlers moved in and claimed land, Native American tribes were pushed off their ancestral territories and forced onto reservations. Their cultures, traditions, and way of life were forever changed, often in ways that brought deep loss and suffering. It's a reality that can't be separated from the tale of the trail. The movement west was driven by the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was meant to stretch from coast to coast. And it did, reaching the Pacific, fueling industry, and paving the way for innovations like the Transcontinental Railroad. By the end of the 1800s, cross-country travel was dramatically faster and safer. But it was the early pioneers in their slow, creaking covered wagons who blazed that path first. Their journey demanded backbreaking labor and constant vigilance. Many never made it. Those who did left behind a story that is as much about courage and persistence as it is about displacement and loss. It's a chapter of American history that is both inspiring and sobering, one we should remember in its full complexity. The Trail's legacy. When the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory, Utah in 1869, completing America's first transcontinental railroad, it marked a turning point in westward migration. The great overland trails, once the lifeline to the frontier, were entering their final chapter. But the Oregon Trail didn't just vanish overnight, it evolved over the decades. The California Gold Rush of 1849 brought a flood of 49ers, transforming not only the trail itself but also the communities along its path. By the 1850s, the U.S. military had increased its presence along the route, and ferries and bridges began making dangerous crossings easier. Steamboats started running on the Columbia River, giving pioneers an alternative to wagon travel for part of the journey. The 1860s brought even more change. Settlements grew, communication leapt forward with the Pony Express, and later the Transcontinental Telegraph, and stagecoach lines expanded, offering faster travel than a wagon ever could. The once remote Oregon Trail was becoming more connected to a rapidly modernizing nation. Even before the railroad, the trail had already been reshaped by progress. New technologies often followed the trail's well-worn path. Telegraph poles went up along its length, and in some stretches, railroad tracks were laid directly over it. While the railroad didn't instantly wipe out wagon travel, it dramatically reduced the need for it. Of all the western routes, the Oregon Trail lasted the longest, partly because the rails didn't reach Oregon until the early 1880s. Even then, the trail found a new purpose, serving as a major route for driving cattle and sheep eastward to market. What had once been a path of migration became a vital link between the growing West and established markets in the East. Today, the Oregon Trail as a continuous, passable route no longer exists, but its legacy is etched into the land. In places, you can still see deep ruts carved into the ground by thousands of wagon wheels. Near Guernsey, Wyoming, these ruts cut as much as 5 feet into solid sandstone, silent testimony to the endless flow of pioneers. At spots like Independence Rock, names and dates scratched into the stone over a century ago still speak across the years, giving us a direct human connection to those who once passed through. Many landmarks along the trail are now preserved. Scottsbluff National Monument and Chimney Rock National Historic Site protect iconic rock formations that served as guideposts and sources of inspiration for weary travelers. Historic Forts Bridger, Kearney, Laramie, and Vancouver, and mission sites like Whitman offer a glimpse into life along the trail. These places, now protected, let us walk in the footsteps of those who helped shape the West. Recognizing its importance, Congress established the Oregon National Historic Trail in 1978, managed by the National Park Service in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management and other agencies. It aims to protect what's left of the trail and make it accessible to the public. Visitors can explore interpretive centers, connect with related national park sites, and gain a richer understanding of westward expansion, its triumphs, struggles, and lasting consequences. The Oregon Trail left its mark not only on the land, but also on American culture. Films and television shows have dramatized its hardships and adventure, including the 1977 miniseries The Oregon Trail. But perhaps its most famous pop culture legacy is the beloved educational video game. First released in the 1980s and 90s, it introduced generations of students to the challenges of migration in a fun but surprisingly accurate way. Updated and re-released in modern formats, the game continues to inspire curiosity about the pioneers who risked everything to head west. From rock carvings in the wilderness to pixels on a screen, the Oregon Trail still speaks to us, reminding us of the determination, courage, and sheer endurance it took to face the unknown and carve a new life out of the western frontier. Annie Oakley, a legendary sharpshooter and one of America's first female stars, used her talent to inspire women. More than chasing fame, she devoted herself to teaching women to shoot, encouraging self-defense, independence, and confidence. Rex Madsen, a cowboy towering over 2 meters, became famous as the tallest cowboy. His remarkable height drew attention everywhere, earning him parade invites and special appearances, always crowned with his trademark hat. In 19th century Arizona and other states, prostitution was legal, with licensed brothels, taxes, and fines helping fund roads, buildings, and public works. Yet, even under the law, sex workers faced deep prejudice and social rejection. In 1907, a small-town cow became a local hero, carrying 7 children to school every day. Life in the Wild West was worlds apart from today. Imagine riding to class on the back of a cow. James Butler Hickok, famously called Wild Bill, stood among the West's most legendary gunmen. Known for deadly accuracy with his twin pistols, he worked as a buffalo hunter, stagecoach guide, and lawman. But it was his gunslinger legend that made him unforgettable. Annie Oakley, raised in a humble home, overcame hardship through her sharp aim. As a girl, she hunted to support her family, catching the attention of Buffalo Bill, who made her a star of his Wild West show in America and Europe. In 1906, Cowclaw, a Tlingit woman from Alaska, donned her potlatch dance attire for a ceremony rich with meaning. The event brought her community together to dance, sing, and honor their stories and heritage. On Alaska's frontier, sex workers of many backgrounds sought fortune during the gold rush. Some succeeded, using their earnings to invest in hotels, restaurants, and saloons that shaped local communities. Pearl Hart stunned the West by robbing a stagecoach in Arizona while dressed as a man. Her fearless act made headlines, earning her fame as an outlaw in swift pursuit by the law. Hunting thrived in Arizona's Four Peaks region, rich with deer, rabbits, bears, and cougars. Only hunters with courage and skill could face the land's dangers and bring home their prize. And Buffalo Bill's Wild West show starred real cowboys, hunters, lawmen, and even ex-outlaws, whose sharpshooting skills became one of the show's biggest attractions. An 1871 photo by William Henry Jackson in Nebraska shows Pataliro, an indigenous leader during a time when native tribes faced land loss and the looming threat of forced assimilation. Pearl Hart shocked the West in 1899 with bold robberies, first stealing $450 from a train, then $2,500 from a bank in Globe, Arizona, before fleeing in a carriage with her partner. Rodeos were beloved celebrations of Wild West life, thrilling crowds with daring feats. At one California rodeo, a woman and her horse soared over a convertible, leaving spectators in awe of her fearless frontier spirit. Seth Kinman, a legendary hunter of the Wild West, was well known for his remarkable skill. When he met President Andrew Johnson, he decided to offer a truly unique gift. He built an extraordinary chair from elk antlers and rawhide, creating a bold, rugged piece that perfectly captured the spirit of the frontier. William Frederick Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill, gained worldwide fame with his Wild West show featuring Native Americans and cowboys. Touring the US and Europe, he wowed audiences, over 2 million in London in 1887 alone, with reenactments, races, gunfights, and parades of over 12,000 people, bringing the Wild West to the global stage. Johnson's quiet life was torn apart when a Crow warrior killed his wife. Consumed by grief and fury, he swore revenge, hunting down every Crow he met. His ruthless vengeance spread his fearsome nickname Liver Eater across the Wild West. Bass Reeves, a legendary lawman of the American frontier, became the first black deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi in 1875. This rare 1877 photo of Billy the Kid, one of only 2 confirmed images of the outlaw, shows him playing cards with friends in New Mexico. Though time has faded it, the picture stands as an unforgettable symbol of Wild West history. Appointed by Judge Isaac Parker, the Hangman of the West, Reeves made over 3,000 arrests, surviving 14 deadly encounters, always preferring to bring criminals in alive. Hunting thrived in the Wild West, especially in Arizona's rugged Four Peaks. This wildlife-rich land, home to deer, rabbits, bears, and cougars, demanded bravery and skill from hunters who faced its many dangers. In the late 1800s, Guthrie, Oklahoma, drew bold settlers chasing new beginnings. Among them, a hopeful newcomer arrived, determined to claim land and build a fresh life in the untamed West. A band of fearless Navajo riders embarks on a long journey across the harsh, sun-baked desert of Canyon de Chelly. With skill and courage, they guide their horses through the rugged, unforgiving land. The Hatfield family, photographed in 1888, became a lasting symbol of the Wild West. Their image reflects pride, unity, and a glimpse into the rugged life of frontier America. In the Wild West, families chased new dreams. In Custer County, Nebraska, 2 sisters built a sod house from packed earth blocks topped with grass, creating warmth and shelter on the open plains. Geronimo, one of history's most renowned Native leaders, led fierce resistance against U.S. forces to protect his people and land. For years, his raids on settlements and troops made him a top adversary of the U.S. Army. Mountain men, the rugged hunters and explorers of the West, thrived in unforgiving wilderness with unmatched survival skills. This photo captures the grit and endurance that defined their hard, adventurous lives. Quanah Parker, the last chief of the Comanches, was a powerful leader in the Wild West. In the 19th century, he fought fiercely against the U.S. Army's push to take native lands, defending his people and their traditions. Life on the frontier was harsh, especially for farmers battling brutal weather and dry soil. In 1894, a sandstorm in Midland, Texas, tore through farmlands, and a photo captured the storm's fierce power. James Miller, nicknamed Killer Miller, was infamous in the Wild West for his deadly accuracy. A hired gun involved in robberies, his violent path ended in 1909 when he was captured and executed for murder. Butch Cassidy, born Robert Leroy Parker in Utah in 1866, became an outlaw legend as leader of the Hole-in-the-Wall gang. Famous for train and bank heists, he also gained notoriety for his skillful disguises and daring escapes. A rare 1863 Civil War photo captures an American soldier playfully posing for the camera, offering a glimpse of humor and humanity amid the war's turmoil. Joe Black Fox, a Sioux performer in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, joined battle reenactments and tribal dances to share his people's traditions. His role let him travel the world and experience new cultures. Iron White Man, a Sioux warrior, joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1883. A master horseman and archer, he dazzled audiences with his precision and skill, becoming a star performer of the troupe. Judge Roy Bean, called the Law West of the Pecos, was an eccentric, hot-tempered judge who often ruled while drunk. He claimed the president had appointed him, though historians doubt the truth of that tale. An 1864 photo of a slave auction house in Atlanta, guarded by a Union soldier, reveals the grim reality of slavery still practiced in Confederate states, even as the Civil War raged to end it. General George Crook, a major 19th century military leader, entered the U.S. Army in 1852 and fought in the Civil War. Later, he led campaigns against native tribes, becoming one of the West's most prominent commanders. Billy the Kid twice escaped prison, once by killing 2 guards and once by digging through a wall with a spoon. Charming, yet dangerous, he even befriended Sheriff Pat Garrett before they became bitter enemies. In 1903, Calamity Jane was photographed at Wild Bill's grave in South Dakota, years after his death. Though their romance is debated, their bond remains a lasting part of Wild West legend. Wyatt Earp, a Wild West legend, headed west at 21 in search of adventure, working as a miner, businessman, and lawman. His fame peaked at the 1881 OK Corral gunfight, cementing him as a symbol of frontier justice. A historic photo of the Deadwood stagecoach shows the heavily guarded vehicle that carried gold, mail, and passengers through dangerous territory, protected by armed men against outlaw attacks. An 1872 photo of Paiute Indians in Utah shows a nomadic people who lived off hunting, fishing, and gathering in the Great Basin. Settler encroachment brought conflict and displacement to their way of life. The white dance was a special social custom where women led, inviting men to dance. Some even knelt to ask, a graceful sign of both respect and admiration. Bill Doolin, once part of the Dalton Gang, formed his own Wild Bunch and robbed across the West. On August 24, 1896, in Oklahoma, he was cornered by U.S. Deputy Marshal Heck Thomas and shot dead while trying to flee. Rose Dunn, born in 1878 in Oklahoma, was a nurse whose life turned to crime after falling for outlaw George. In 1895, she and her family were arrested after a deadly shootout with sheriffs. A 1907 photo from Tascosa, Texas, shows cowboys unwinding in a local bar, capturing a slice of Wild West life. Their mixed expressions, some grinning, others stern, bring the moment vividly to life. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered Americans 160 acres of public land if they built a home and farmed it for 5 years. Many moved to Nebraska seeking a better life, but faced harsh weather, scarce supplies, and isolation while building their farms. In 1894, a law office in Round Pond, Oklahoma, helped pioneers file land claims, secure property rights, and turn their frontier hopes into legal ownership. The Rufus Buck Gang, a band of young African Americans and indigenous men, waged a wave of robberies, thefts, and kidnappings in defiance of the law. Their reign of terror in the Wild West ended after capture, with all members sentenced to hang. Cowboys sit by supply wagons between 1880 and 1910. Native Americans stand in front of teepees in Aberdeen, South Dakota, 1880. Chief Iron Bear at Fort Berthold, North Dakota, 1866. Train at the Short Line Depot in Boise, Idaho between 1880 and 1900. Ox teams in Sturgis, Dakota Territory between 1887 and 1892. George Carnac, miner, stands outside his log cabin in Yukon Territory, 1897. A prairie schooner from the 1850s, photographed in 1894. Western Ranch House in the Dakotas, 1888. Pioneer family outside their sod house, 1882. Chinese miners in Tuolumne County, California, 1866. Sunflower, Portrait of a Sioux Man, 1899. City of Deadwood seen from the south, 1876. Holiday's Overland Stage Office, Denver, Colorado, between 1865 and 1870. Miner's Cabin in Winter, Colorado, between 1898 and 1905. John Delane Wagon Shop, Broken Bow, Custer County, Nebraska, 1889. Geyser Springs in Sonoma County, California, 1880. Camp of the 7th Cavalry at Pine Ridge Agency, South Dakota, January 19, 1891. A deer hunt near Deadwood in the winter of 1887 to 88, with miners McMillan and Hubbard posing with their game. Gold miners at El Dorado, California, between 1848 and 1853. Horse-drawn vehicle in Dodge City, Kansas, between 1880 and 1910. The successful hunters at camp on Oak Creek, Arizona, 1887. Two Apache women at a campfire, 1903. Changing horses on a roundup, South Dakota, 1890. Miner's Cabin in the Sierra Nevada Mountains, 1866. Railroad bridge across the Kansas River, 1867. "40 Indian canoes at Daya, 1897. The Deadwood Coach, 1889. The Principal Street in Prescott, Arizona, 1877. Hotel tent along the Grand Canyon Stage Road, Arizona, between 1890 and 1899. Land rush in Oklahoma, 1889. Black Hills Treasure Coach between 1887 and 1892. Cowboys roping a buffalo on the plains between 1887 and 1892. Teepees along the Columbia River, 1922. Loading cattle at McCoy's stockyard, Abilene, Kansas, 1867. The Old Cabin Home, South Dakota, between 1887 and 1892. D. Dunn just landed on his claim in Custer County, Nebraska, 1886. Indian family in front of an adobe building, California, 1880. Dick Latham returning home with Antelope, Wyoming, 1888. Ponca Indian Scouts skinning a buffalo at 101 Ranch, Bliss, Oklahoma, 1890. Gold miners and their friends in Colorado, 1898. Coburg, Nebraska Territory between 1884 and 1885. Sioux City party coaching at the Great Hot Springs of Dakota, 1889. Klondike miners at Skagway, Alaska, 1897. Drover's Cottage at McCoy's Stockyard, Abilene, Kansas, 1867. The result of a leak, 2 men repairing a boat in the Yukon Territory, 1897. Roundup scenes on Belle Fourche, 1887. Indian Boy and His Dog, Utah, 1874. Shoshone Indians between 1880 and 1910. Nebraska Cowboys, possibly from Round Valley, Custer County, 1888. Mule-drawn water wagon at Fort Verde, Arizona, 1887. Camp Life, Arizona, 1871. Freighting in the Black Hills between 1887 and 1892. Camp wagon on a Texas Roundup, 1900. Old Mission Church, Zuni Pueblo, New Mexico, 1873. My First House in Nebraska, Solomon D. Butcher, in front of his dugout, 1886. Art Pulliam hunting coyotes in West Union, Custer County, Nebraska, 1889. San Miguel Church, Santa Fe, New Mexico, 1873. Hydraulic mining at Rockerville, South Dakota, 1889. Montana Mine, 1889. Camp at Crossing of the Colorado, 1871. Buffalo at Water, 1904. Packing water on mules, Fort Verde, Arizona, 1887. Cowboys from the XIT Ranch in the Texas Panhandle, 1902. Colonel Dupersal's Ranch in New Mexico, 1885. Pueblo Indian with Lasso, 1890. Wells Fargo and Company's Express Office, Virginia City, Nevada, 1866. Hunting camp at Peck's Lake, 21 miles north of Fort Verde, Arizona, 1887. Pioneer's Cabin, Calaveras Big Trees State Park, California, 1886. Deadwood Central Railroad Engineer Corps, 1888. Fort Sill, Indian Territory, looking from the southeast, 1889. The Tunnel Gould and Curry Mine, Nevada, 1866. The Interview, South Dakota, between 1887 and 1892. Navajo Indians near Old Fort Defiance, New Mexico, 1873. J. M. Webster and Family, Wyandotte, Kansas, 1867. Officers' Quarters, Camp Apache, Arizona Territory, 1871. Hunting Camp of Captain Scott, Washita River Reservation, 1895. California Company's Stages Leaving Virginia City, 1866. Artesian Well in Kern County, California, 1880. Washing and Panning Gold, Rockerville, Dakota, 1889. Three Women and a Man on Horseback, all in uniform, Fort Verde, Arizona, between 1884 and 1887. Returning to Camp Well Crowned, Oregon, 1880. Branding Calves on a Roundup, 1888. Horsebacks Camp Comanches, Fort Sill, Indian Territory, 1873. Gold Dust, Placer Mining at Rockerville, South Dakota, 1889. Seen on the summit of the Sierra Nevada Mountains, 1866. The Annie, first boat launched on Yellowstone Lake, 1871. Ranch in Mendocino County, California, 1870. Wells Fargo Express Company Treasure Wagon and Guards, South Dakota, 1890. Cradling Placer Mining, 1871. The Bartee Ranch on Hat Creek, South Dakota, 1890. The last large bull train on its way from the railroad to the Black Hills, 1890. a Mexican home, Ranchita, New Mexico, between 1880 and 1897. Burlington Engine Number 7, Nebraska, 1886. Scout Mobile in Kiowa, wartime costume, 1891. Chinese immigrants sluicing, 1871. Making pictures, photographer at the Aquarius Plateau, Utah, 1875. Stacking alfalfa hay at the Stockdale Ranch, California, 1888. Covered wagon travel was a brutal gamble, every mile tested strength, hope, and sheer will. Yet, through hardship and loss, pioneers carved the road west and changed America forever. If this journey amazed you, share it. Subscribe to Back to Yesterday, and join us for more untold stories of the past.